Okay, Poppy got to meet Mr. Canad yesterday, and he pretty much told her they better do what he wants them to do, or Rye could be in serious trouble. So let's see what Poppy does about this. Chapter 17. And by the way, it's Friday. It's cloudy, but it's warm and nice outside. And Mr. Mike just reminded me that every day when I talk about what the weather is while I'm reading, it's actually a week or so before you get to where I'm reading, because I'm reading a week ahead of you guys. So if you're wondering why I say it's sunny and pretty and it's really raining, now you know why. Okay, chapter 17, To Help Rye. I found out where Rye is, Poppy shouted as she burst into the nest. The beavers in the pond have caught him. They told me they won't let him go, or worse, unless you all move from the nest. The announcement brought stunned silence. It was followed by an eruption of squeaking, squealing, and talking. Clover put paws on either side of her head and cried, "It's too much." Valerian muttered, "I don't think I can take any more. No, I don't think I can." This seemed to give permission for the younger children to go out of control. They raced around in circles, shouting, "It's too much, it's too much." Older children huddled in a corner and kept saying things such as, "This is so awful." The chaos continued until Valerian, standing tall, cried, "Quiet, please." The nest stilled. "Poppy," Valerian said, "how do you know about this?" Poppy repeated her conversation with Mr. Canad, concluding with the beaver's threat that if the mice did not move, Rye would remain a captive. Or they might do worse, she said. Clover opened her black eyes wide. "What do you mean, worse?" she asked. "I think the beaver was threatening to harm Rye." "Now why?" Valerian cried with exasperation. "Did the boy have to go off and do such a thing?" "I bet," Thistle injected boldly. "He just wanted to show everybody he was as good as ragweed. That's why." Thistle's comment made Poppy look down at her toes. "That's great," Valerian exclaimed with a rare show of anger. "If that's what he intended, then he's made things worse for himself and us." Valerian's words threw the nest into another uproar. Everyone was talking at once, and no one to no particular purpose. Clover's small, shrill voice rose above the clamor. "My dear family," she cried, "we can't take this kind of life anymore. We need to find peace. I think we'd better move out of this area entirely and start over again. Let the beavers have the brook." Poppy hardly knew what to say, other than to feel that in some way she was responsible for what had happened. "But," she offered timidly, "isn't there anything we can do?" "Do?" Valerian returned, eyes full of anguish. "Poppy, I tried to compromise with them. They would have none of it. Clover's right. If we're to preserve this family, we've little choice." "I'm sorry," Poppy murmured. "Miss Poppy," Clover said, her voice shrill with tenseness, "you've been kind enough to come here and bring us the sad news about ragweed. Rye is our problem, not yours. You must let us handle things our own way. But Clover, Poppy replied as gently as she could, I'm not sure that even if you do leave, they'll let Rye go. But you said that Mr. Canad promised he'd release Rye when we move, Clover cried. What choice do we have but to trust them? Clover is right, Valerian agreed. It's the family we need to protect. There's little more to be said. With that, the mice began to scurry about, putting their possessions in order. It did not take long for Poppy to realize how much in the way, how much of an outsider she was. Mortified, but not wishing to intrude any more than she already had, she crept from the nest. Night had come. The moon's reflection lay upon the pond's surface like a tarnished spot of gold. Poppy could make out the islands and lodge tops surrounded by dark water. She thought about Rye. Just to think of him languishing in the beaver's lodge gave her pain. And longing, she sighed out loud. Don't worry, came a voice from behind her. It's not your fault. Poppy turned. It was Thistle. You shouldn't take it personally, Thistle went on. Our family has been having a bummer summer. I know. The two mice sat silently, side by side. But I bet, Thistle said after a while, I know why Rye did it. Do you? Poppy said with some hesitation. Why? Poppy, Thistle asked shyly. Did you know Rye before you came here? A little. How did you know? Well, Thistle said, too bashful to face Poppy directly. It was when you were talking about ragweed, when you first came. I noticed the way you two looked at each other. Rye acted as if he was going to die. You didn't look so great either. Poppy turned toward the pond and gazed at the big lodge. Then it is my fault he's where he is, she said. Poppy, Thistle said. What? You didn't make Rye do it. He went on his own. He's not your responsibility. Don't do anything weird. I won't, Poppy replied. You all right? Thistle asked, touching Poppy gently. Oh, yes, Poppy replied. I just need to be alone. Okay, the young mouse said, and she slipped back down into the nest. Left to herself, Poppy allowed the darkness to give her solace. Without thinking about what she was doing, she meandered down to the pond. If only I could tell Rye that. She paused. With a jolt, Poppy recalled that she had yet to have so much as one conversation with the mouse. And yet, she seemed to have had many. It was so extraordinary. Poppy reminded herself that she didn't need to be with Rye. After all, she had spent her whole life, 6 months, without him. Yet she wanted to be with him. It was hard to sort out the difference. When she reached the water's edge, Poppy gazed out at the beaver's lodge, trying to recall in exactly which one Mr. Canad had said Rye was being held. When she was sure she had located the right one, she just stared at it. Knowing she was a bit closer to Rye gave her comfort. She wished she were a good swimmer. She meandered along the shore of the pond, looking for nothing in particular, but hoping some idea would come. When she came upon a splinter of wood, she picked it up and balanced it in her paws. "Make a good paddle," she mused. The moment she had that thought, she knew exactly what she was looking for. A piece of wood to use as a raft. With it, she could float over the pond and get to Rye, somehow. Clutching the would-be paddle tightly, Poppy began a search. Near the stump of a chewed-down tree, she found a thin, wide chip of wood. A raft. Pushing and pulling, Poppy worked the wood chip to the water's edge, then set it afloat. The chip rode the water easily. Poppy leaped aboard. The chip wobbled, but soon steadied itself. She was afloat. Chapter 18, To the Lodge. Using her wood splinter as a paddle, Poppy pushed off from the shore. The raft lurched erratically until she found a way to balance it. Then, from a kneeling position, she dipped the paddle into the dark waters and began to propel herself across the pond. Repetitious cricket sounds tickled the air. From somewhere a fox barked, a night bird called, a frog croaked. Above, the spread of stars made Poppy think of a field of bright, scattered seeds. The moon seemed to be as adrift as she. She gazed around, trying to get her bearings, trying to recall where the main lodge was. From the middle of the pond, everything seemed different. The moonlight did allow her to make out the humps of lodges as well as islands. They seemed all alike now. She had no idea which way to go. Poppy paddled some more, moving farther over the pond, knowing she had to go somewhere. She chose at random and headed for one of the islands. From out of the darkness, she heard a splash. Coming unexpectedly, it made her jump. The next moment, the raft began to rock wildly. Only by holding on tightly did she manage to keep from tumbling off. When the waters calmed, she strained to look through the darkness to determine what had caused this sound. She saw nothing. What if it were a beaver? Poppy wondered, would it see her? Dimly, she made out an island to her left. Its small size drew her. It would be easy to search. But after Poppy took a few more strokes, the little island seemed to have moved. Not quite believing what her eyes were telling her, Poppy stared hard. Sure enough, even as she looked, the island shifted again. She gave a few more tentative paddle strokes. Suddenly, the island moved and raised its head. Poppy gasped. It was a beaver. She had almost paddled right into it. Then to her right, there was another swell of water, and a second beaver broke the pond's surface. Poppy was between them. It was the darkness that hid her. "That you, Judy?" asked the newcomer. "It's me," grunted the first. "Who's that?" "Me, Joe." What are you doing? Taking a swim to cool off. The lodge is hot. Yeah, hard to sleep. Hey, did you see that mouse? Judy asked. The one Cass caught, said the beaver named Joe. I was sleeping right next to his cage. What about him? What a pain, Judy said. If it were up to me, I'd just give him a swat with the old tail. Hey, you know Cass, progress without pain. Right, sure, Joe said. I'm going back. Okay, see ya. The beaver named Joe swam off. Poppy paddled after him as hard as she could. Abruptly, he drove beneath the water. Poppy waited and watched for him to resurface. When he didn't, she understood what was happening. The beaver must have gone into the lodge through an underwater passage. She scrutinized the area. Sure enough, a large mound stuck out of the water nearby. She paddled until she bumped against it, then deftly leapt from her raft to the lodge. The movement inadvertently kicked the raft away. She made a grab for it, but the wood ship had already floated out of reach. Resigned to being where she was, Poppy took a careful look around. The lodge was a mass of sticks, twigs, logs, leaves, and vines. Maggie. Tightly woven together and cemented with mud. It made her think of an upside-down bird's nest. Somewhere inside was Rye. Her sense of urgency renewed. Poppy returned to the water's edge and wondered if she had the courage to swim down and find the lodge's entryway. When she reminded herself what a bad swimmer she was, she began to crawl about the lodge. She had to find a way to get in. It was at the very top of the lodge, while prying and poking amid the mud and sticks, that she discovered a hole. When she put her nose over it, she was certain she detected the flow of air and the distinct smell of beaver, or at least Mr. Canad. A vent hole, perhaps. Upon examining the hole closely, she found it was big enough for her to crawl through. Perhaps it could lead her inside. Nervous, she crept in, head first. The hole was pitch black and slimy, with a sickening stench of rotting mud. It was hard to hold on. After going down a few inches, she paused. How long is this hole? She asked herself. Will I be able to get out fast if I have to? What's going to be at the end of it? Do I really want to do this? She answered herself in one word. Rye. She had to get Rye. She went on, and to keep from falling, she pressed her paws tightly against the slippery sides. Down she went. It seemed endless, and it happened. She was concentrating so hard, she came to the end of the hole without realizing she'd reached it. Catching herself just in time, she peered down into the lodge. Such light as there was came from an occasional flashing glow of fireflies. At first, Poppy thought she was looking at nothing but lumpy earth. Only gradually did she see that right below her was a room of sleeping beavers. She gasped. There were so many. Some lay on their backs, chins up. Their teeth seemed to glow like burning embers. Some beavers were flopped over others. Others laid on their bellies, tails occasionally flipping and flapping like loose flags. In their restless sleep, they kept shifting about, moaning, grunting, and growling. It was as if a large mass of mud had become alive. From her high perch, Poppy searched about for the cage Mr. Canad had spoken of, the one in which Rye was being held. She found it tucked away in a corner. She even thought she saw Rye, curled up in a ball, fast asleep. How was she going to get down to him? She dared not jump. If she did, she'd land right in the midst of the beavers. That was a risk she did not want to take. Then she remembered something she had seen on the lodge's roof vines. Perhaps she could lower herself down, but she'd have to work fast before the beavers awoke. Poppy clawed her way back up to the lodge roof and searched for the vine. When she found two twisted about a stick, she took the longest. Working fast, she tied one end of the vine to the stick, and taking its free end in her mouth, she crept back down the hole. When she reached the end again, she lowered the vine. It dangled free, but it was impossible to see exactly how far the vine went. Was it too far or not far enough? Poppy could not tell. Why was she risking her life this way, she asked herself. The same answer came as before. Rye. Taking a deep breath, her heart was beating madly. She gasped the vine tightly with her front paws, wrapped her rear legs and tail about it too, and headed down the vine head first. She reached the end. It was too short. She was dangling some 12 inches over the beavers. To go any further, she would have to drop and land on a beaver's nose. The thought of it gave Poppy the shudders. As she tried to make up her mind what to do, Poppy's shoulders began to ache painfully. She had to either let go or go back up. She looked up. The vent hole seemed a very long way up. She looked down. The beavers seemed enormous and powerful. What would they do to her if she dropped on them? More and more nervous, her palms grew sweaty. She shifted her grip. The shifting made the vine sway slightly. She tried to stop it, but the swinging only increased. Suddenly, she had an idea. Carefully, she turned about. Now she held the vine just with her paws. Her legs and tail dangled. Poppy began to pump her rear legs hard. It made the vine sway even more. Back and forth she swung until she was moving in a great arc, like a pendulum. With every swing, her heart thumped. When Poppy reached the highest point of arc, nearest to Rye, she let go. Out she sailed through the air, right over the sleeping beavers, until she landed with a plop in the soft mud close to Rye's cage. There she lay, panting, heart hammering, trying to recover her breath. Had she really done it? Almost afraid to look, she lifted her head. When she saw she was beyond the beavers, she took a deep sigh of relief. She turned toward the cage. There was nothing between her and it. The way was clear. Suddenly, she crept forward and peered inside. A firefly flashed. She saw Rye. He was curled up in a ball, fast asleep. Poppy tried to reach through the bars to touch him. He was too far away. Rye, she called softly. Rye. Rye lifted a sleepy head and peered through the dark. It was by the light of a glowing firefly that he saw Poppy's face. Astonished, he squinted, unsure of what he was seeing was a dream or real. But when Poppy said, "Oh, Rye, how glad I am to see you," he knew she was the most real creature he had ever seen. Chapter 19, Poppy and Rye. Poppy and Rye gazed at one another by the light of firefly flashes. He was quite sure he was looking at the most beautiful whiskers and pink nose he had ever seen upon any mouse with whom he had been acquainted. Poppy was sure Rye's face, covered as it was with delicate orange fur, was extraordinarily noble. What's more, he had altogether splendid ears, and the small notch in the right ear only added character. "What?" Rye said in a choked whisper. "Are you doing here?" "I came to see if you're all right." "But why?" "Because you dance beautifully," Poppy replied, though it made her whiskers tremble to say it. "Thank you. And you dance as if there were moonbeams in your toes." "And Rye?" "What?" "I did love Ragweed," Poppy said. "I'll never pretend I didn't. But he's gone." Rye hung his head. "I know. And Rye, you need to know. I never danced with him." Rye looked up. His whiskers shook. "Poppy, you are the most kind, the most unselfish of mice," he whispered. "In fact, you are altogether splendid." For a moment, neither spoke. Then Poppy said, "Rye, why did you come here?" I wanted to do something about the beavers, to get rid of them somehow, except I didn't have a plan. The truth is, Poppy, I wanted to prove myself to you. They caught me before I could do anything. Mr. Canad told me you were being held captive," Poppy said. "He said if your family didn't move, he would keep you forever." "Forever?" Rye repeated dramatically. "But Poppy, it will have been worth it." "Why?" "Because you came." "But don't you want to get out?" Poppy asked. "I'd like to, but I think I've made things much worse." Poppy reached her paw through the bars and touched Rye's shoulder. "That you even tried seems brave to me," she said. "Do you truly think so?" "Yes, just maybe. Well, too bold." It is just now starting to pour down rain. I kept noticing it was getting dark because I can't see my book very well. Rye took hold of Poppy's paws, which were resting on his shoulder, and kissed it. "What you said means more than a life supply of sunflower seeds," he murmured. They looked at one another. Then Rye said, How did you get in here? There's a hole in the roof. I crawled down a vine. You are amazing, he said. Poppy blushed with pleasure. Rye became alarmed. But how are you going to get out? He asked. Poppy was about to say the same way, but even as she had the thought, she realized it would be impossible for her to use the vine. It was dangling too high over the beavers for her to reach. I'm not sure, Poppy said. I swam in through an underwater tunnel, the way the beavers do. It's not too bad. You could go that way. I don't swim very well. Oh, don't worry, I'll think of something. Neither mouse spoke. Instead, they looked at one another by the glow of fireflies. Rye, Poppy said, suddenly becoming more brisk as she felt the urgency to leave. Have you tried chewing through those bars? They're too tough. Poppy tried for herself. She gave up quickly. I see what you mean. I'm afraid, Rye said. I really am going to stay here forever. I suppose I'll die of old age and regret. Rye, what? Please. I know the bars are tough, but keep chewing on them. I'll find a way to get you back to your family nest. They need to know you're all right. And maybe if I get a longer vine, one that reaches the ground, we could get out that way. Do you think so? Maybe. She started to back away. Rye, clinging to the twig bars, called, Poppy, what? I'm deeply moved that you came, but maybe you shouldn't return. I don't want you to risk your life for me. But Rye, she said, taking a few more steps toward the cage. What? I would like to dance again. Oh, Poppy, Rye cried out. So would I, with you. Shh, Poppy cautioned as she backed away, unable to take her eyes from Rye. She stumbled over a sleeping beaver's tail. She stood still. Rye, looking on, was horrified. For a long moment they dared not move. Finally, the beaver rolled away, then settled down, never having awakened. Poppy crept over to the far wall. The way was muddy. By pressing up against the wall, she was able to skirt a large sleeping beaver and come around to the edge of the watery gate. Once there, she gazed into the murky water. Apprehensively, she looked around to see if there was any way to get up to the vine. It was impossible. She had no choice. Reluctantly, she turned back to the water. The prospect of swimming caused her so much dread. She felt compelled to give herself a reassuring hug. Take a deep breath. She jumped, hitting the water with a splash. Across the lodge, Mr. Canad sat up and looked around. He had heard something. Taking a few sniffs, he detected a vague and unusual smell. He peered about but saw nothing except bulky beavers sleeping. All seemed perfectly normal. And yet, what was it he had heard? He sniffed again. This time he detected the faint smell of mouse. Could the mouse have escaped? Better safe than sorry, Mr. Canad allowed, and got up. Approaching Rye's cage, He peered through the gloom. At first he couldn't see Rye, but by listening, he heard the sound of chewing. He crept closer to the cage. Rye was at the back of the cage, gnawing on a bar. Mr. Canad broke into a toothy smile. "Well, bless my teeth and soothe my tail," he snorted. "You're trying to be a beaver." Rye, taken by surprise, looked up. "Don't think you should try chewing your way out, pal," Mr. Canad said. "We need you to stay." Glorying, Rye said nothing. "Just back away from those bars, pal. You don't want to cross over the line and force my paw. If I do something bad, it'll be your fault." Rye stepped away. "Way to go, pal. Now look," Mr. Canad went on to say, "I think I'll catch my Z's here. For the next few days anyway, don't want to unlock the barn door after the horses are gone." Mr. Canad was about to settle himself when he recalled the noise that had woken him. If this mouse was here, what was that sound? Now that he thought about it, could it have been a splash? He sat up and counted his beavers, all present and accounted for. He did an inspection around the cage area. In the mud were Poppy's prints. "You've had a visitor," the beaver suddenly exclaimed. "Haven't you?" "Leave me alone," Rye cried. "Never mind," said Mr. Canad. "One picture is worth 1,000 words. One of your pals was here." The beaver scrutinized the lodge intently. By a firefly flash, he caught sight of the vine dangling from the lodge roof. Mr. Canad grunted. "The vent hole." He lumbered across the lodge floor and ripped the vine down. "Better plaster some mud over that hole," he thought. "I can always make some other holes and hide them. Don't want any mice in the ointment." Well, now we don't know whether Poppy made it through the water. And he's going to close up the vent hole, and that was the way that I'm sure she was going to try to get back down. So I don't know what's going to happen. We need to think about making our prediction for the day. I'm not really sure what I think is going to happen. We'll have to think about it. And oh my gosh, we have the whole weekend to think. We won't find out until Monday what happened. Have a nice weekend. Bye.